The rain had been falling over London for hours when a young woman stood quietly inside Kensington Palace, listening to footsteps echo through long stone corridors. She was only 18 years old. Outside, the city was waking beneath a blanket of grey clouds, unaware that its future had already changed. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, horses pulled carts through muddy streets, chimney smoke drifted into the cool morning air, and shopkeepers unlocked wooden shutters for another ordinary day. But this day would not remain ordinary for long. Before the sun climbed high above the rooftops, a messenger arrived carrying news that would reshape not only Britain, but much of the world. King William IV was dead. The young princess, who had spent her childhood surrounded by strict rules, careful supervision, and constant expectations, was now Queen Victoria. It is tempting to imagine that history changes with grand speeches or thunderous battles. Yet sometimes it changes in silence. A single knock upon a palace door. A quiet announcement spoken in respectful tones. An 18-year-old woman standing alone before realizing that an empire stretching across oceans now rested upon her shoulders. That moment became one of the turning points of the 19th century. Yet the empire Victoria inherited was far from the unstoppable giant many people remember today. It contained enormous opportunities, but also deep political divisions, growing social unrest, and questions that no monarch alone could answer. Tonight, we will follow the remarkable story of Queen Victoria, not simply as the ruler whose name came to define an age, but as a young woman navigating uncertainty while an empire expanded to heights never before imagined. Along the way, we will meet politicians, inventors, factory workers, explorers, servants, soldiers, and ordinary families whose lives were shaped by decisions made thousands of miles away. If you enjoy these slow journeys through history, consider taking a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, perhaps leave your city and the local time in the comments. There is something comforting about knowing that, while history belongs to the past, these stories are shared by people awake, or drifting toward sleep, all around the world. Now settle into a comfortable position. Let the room become still. Let today's worries fade into the background. Tonight, we are traveling back to 19th century Britain, where candlelight flickered across palace windows, steam engines began transforming entire landscapes, and a young queen prepared to lead one of history's greatest empires. To understand Victoria's reign, however, we must begin before her birth. Britain at the dawn of the 19th century was a nation living through extraordinary change. The Industrial Revolution had begun reshaping everyday life with astonishing speed. Rivers that had once powered small watermills now stood beside towering factories. Coal mines reached deeper beneath the earth. Iron bridges crossed rivers that had challenged travelers for centuries. Steam engines puffed steadily across workshops and eventually along railway lines, carrying goods and people faster than previous generations could have imagined. The countryside still dominated much of Britain, but cities were growing with remarkable speed. London had become one of the largest cities on earth. Manchester echoed with the sounds of spinning machines. Birmingham forged metal goods shipped across continents. Liverpool bustled with ships arriving from distant ports carrying cotton, tea, sugar, timber, spices, and countless other products that connected Britain to an increasingly global economy. Yet prosperity was not shared equally. For many factory workers, long days stretched from dawn until darkness. Smoke filled the air. Children often worked alongside adults in dangerous conditions. Families crowded into narrow streets where sanitation struggled to keep pace with expanding populations. Disease spread easily through neighborhoods built faster than they could safely support. Britain was becoming wealthier than ever before, but it was also becoming more unequal. At the same time, Europe itself was trembling beneath the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte. Wars swept across the continent for years, drawing Britain into repeated conflict with France. Soldiers marched through fields scarred by cannon fire. Naval fleets battled across rough seas. Governments worried constantly about invasion, revolution, and shifting alliances. When Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815, Britain emerged as one of the world's strongest powers. Its navy dominated the oceans. Its merchants traded across distant continents. Its financial influence expanded steadily. Yet peace brought new questions. How should such a vast nation be governed? How could prosperity reach ordinary people? And what role should the monarchy play in an age increasingly shaped by industry, science, and political reform? These questions would eventually define Victoria's reign. But first, there was a child. Alexandrina Victoria was born on May 24, 1819, at Kensington Palace in London. Few people expected that she would one day become queen. Ahead of her stood several older relatives in the line of succession. Royal families often appeared secure from the outside, but illness, unexpected deaths, and changing fortunes could quickly transform the future. Victoria's father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, died when she was less than a year old. His death left the infant princess growing up without the guidance of her father. Her mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, became deeply protective of her only child. The young princess's upbringing would later become famous for its strictness. Known today as the Kensington system, her daily life was carefully controlled. She rarely spent time alone. She was expected to follow detailed routines. Even climbing stairs often required another person beside her. Every activity, every friendship, every lesson seemed designed to shape her into a disciplined future monarch, or perhaps, critics argued, into someone easily influenced by those around her. Whether all these restrictions achieved their intended purpose remains open to debate. What they certainly accomplished was giving young Victoria a powerful desire for independence. She loved drawing and painting. She practiced languages with remarkable dedication. Tutors introduced her to history, geography, literature, religion, and constitutional government. She learned French, German, Italian, and other subjects expected of European royalty. But education was never only academic. Every conversation reminded her that she occupied an unusual place in society. Adults spoke carefully around her. Visitors bowed with practiced formality. Letters arrived discussing matters she was too young to fully understand. As she grew older, another realization slowly became impossible to ignore. One by one, the people standing ahead of her in the succession disappeared. Deaths within the royal family gradually transformed an unlikely possibility into an approaching certainty. Victoria herself reportedly learned the truth while examining a family tree prepared by one of her tutors. Looking at the chart, she understood that she would probably become queen. According to later accounts, her response was simple. "I will be good." Whether those exact words were spoken precisely as remembered is difficult to know. Memories often become polished over time. Yet the sentiment reflected something genuine. Even at a young age, Victoria understood that duty would define her life. Still, knowing one's future and living it are very different things. By the 1830s, Britain itself continued changing at extraordinary speed. Railways began linking towns once separated by slow journeys over rough roads. Newspapers spread information faster than ever before. Political reform gradually expanded voting rights, though many people still remained excluded. Scientific discoveries challenged long-held assumptions about nature and society. It seemed as though the entire world was accelerating. And beneath all this progress lay quiet anxieties. Industrial wealth created fortunes of unimaginable size, while poverty remained widespread. The empire continued expanding overseas, bringing enormous economic opportunities but also conflict, conquest, and complicated moral questions that historians continue debating today. The British monarchy itself had recently suffered periods of declining popularity. Some earlier kings had faced criticism over politics, personal behavior, or strained relationships with Parliament. Many wondered whether the institution could adapt to a rapidly modernizing nation. Victoria would soon confront these expectations herself. When King William IV died during the early hours of June 20, 1837, protocol moved swiftly. Archbishops, officials, and senior nobles travelled through London's quiet streets toward Kensington Palace. The young princess was awakened and informed that she was now queen. Observers later recalled her remarkable composure. She requested a few moments to prepare herself before receiving the delegation. Dressed simply, without unnecessary display, she entered the room where experienced statesmen bowed before their new sovereign. She was 18 years old. Many expected that ministers, older relatives, or ambitious advisers would dominate the inexperienced queen. Yet Victoria surprised nearly everyone. She listened carefully. She asked thoughtful questions. She insisted upon making decisions personally. One symbolic act carried enormous meaning. Almost immediately after becoming queen, she arranged to move away from her mother's apartments within Kensington Palace. The strict childhood system that had surrounded her for years came to an end. Freedom arrived on the same day as responsibility. The contrast could hardly have been greater. For the first time in her life, Victoria possessed independence. Yet she also carried constitutional duties affecting millions of people across Britain and far beyond its shores. Fortunately, she was not expected to govern alone. Britain had gradually evolved into a constitutional monarchy. Real political power increasingly rested with elected ministers and parliament rather than the sovereign. The monarch retained influence, certainly, but successful government depended upon cooperation rather than absolute authority. Among the first and most important figures Victoria encountered was Prime Minister Lord Melbourne. William Lamb, better known as Lord Melbourne, became far more than a political advisor. Calm, experienced, patient, and deeply knowledgeable about government, he helped guide the young queen through constitutional practice. Their conversations covered everything from official documents to personalities within Parliament. Melbourne recognized that Victoria possessed intelligence and determination, but also understandable inexperience. Rather than overwhelming her with instructions, he encouraged questions. He explained why certain traditions mattered. He described the delicate balance between crown, ministers, and parliament. He helped transform an uncertain teenager into a confident constitutional monarch. Some critics worried that Victoria became too dependent upon Melbourne's advice. Others believed his influence prevented serious mistakes during the opening years of her reign. History rarely offers simple answers. What seems clear is that their partnership provided stability at precisely the moment Britain needed it. Yet beneath this calm beginning, larger forces were already gathering. Factories continued multiplying. Railways stretched farther across the countryside. Cities expanded almost faster than maps could record them. Political reformers demanded greater representation. Workers organized for better conditions. Across the oceans, Britain's empire connected territories so distant that news often required months to travel between them. The young queen had inherited far more than a crown. She had inherited a world in motion. And although the early months of her reign appeared peaceful, events were quietly unfolding that would test not only Victoria herself, but the very nature of monarchy in an industrial age. For a little while, it seemed as though confidence and optimism would define these opening years. But history rarely remains still for long. Before Queen Victoria could become the enduring symbol of an empire at its greatest extent, she would first have to navigate political storms, public expectations, and a meeting that would change both her personal life and the future of Europe. That story, however, was only just beginning. For a time, Britain seemed content to believe that the young queen had settled comfortably into her role. Newspapers praised her dignity, crowds gathered eagerly whenever her carriage appeared, and many people felt that the monarchy, after years of uncertainty under previous rulers, had found a fresh beginning. Yet beneath the polite ceremonies and carefully arranged public appearances, politics remained every bit as complicated as before. The throne itself was secure, but governments rose and fell according to Parliament. Ministers argued over reform, taxation, trade, religion, and the growing demands of an industrial society. Victoria quickly discovered that wearing a crown did not mean always getting one's way. That lesson arrived sooner than she expected. One of the earliest constitutional crises of her reign became known as the Bedchamber Crisis of 1839. The name sounds almost trivial, as though history had been interrupted by a disagreement over palace furniture. The reality was more significant. It concerned the ladies who served as companions to the Queen, women who were not merely attendants but also close personal friends. When Lord Melbourne's government resigned, the Conservative leader Sir Robert Peel was invited to form a new ministry. Peel believed that some of Victoria's ladies, whose families were closely connected to the outgoing Whig government, should be replaced with politically neutral figures. From his perspective, this was a reasonable request. From Victoria's perspective, it felt deeply personal. She refused. To the young Queen, these women were trusted companions rather than political symbols. Losing them seemed unfair and unnecessary. Peel, believing he could not govern effectively under those circumstances, declined to take office. Melbourne returned as Prime Minister. At first glance, Victoria appeared victorious. She had defended her independence. Crowds cheered her determination. Yet historians often point to this episode as an important moment of growth. Over time, Victoria came to understand that a constitutional monarch could not always separate personal feelings from public responsibilities. It was not an easy lesson. But it was a necessary one. As the years passed, she gradually became more politically neutral, helping preserve the monarchy during an age when many European royal families faced revolution or collapse. Still, another chapter of her life was about to begin, one that was far more personal than politics. To understand its importance, we must leave Britain for a moment and travel into the network of royal families that connected Europe. Long before modern diplomacy relied upon instant communication, marriages between royal houses often strengthened alliances. Princes and princesses moved between kingdoms carrying not only family ties but also political expectations. Among these relatives was a young German prince named Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert had first met Victoria when both were teenagers. The meeting had been arranged by relatives who quietly hoped affection might eventually blossom into marriage. At the time, nothing was certain. Royal introductions did not always produce happy endings. Years later, Albert visited Britain again. Victoria was immediately struck by how much he had changed. He was intelligent without arrogance. Thoughtful rather than loud. Serious, but capable of warmth and quiet humor. He loved music, science, architecture, and learning. He believed deeply in discipline, education, and public service. Most importantly, Victoria genuinely enjoyed his company. According to her journals, she admired his appearance as well. She wrote about his kind eyes, his graceful manner, and the calm confidence he seemed to carry naturally. Protocol required that the reigning monarch propose marriage, since no one could presume to ask a queen to marry. And so, in October 1839, Victoria herself asked Albert to become her husband. He accepted. The wedding took place on February 10, 1840, inside the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. London celebrated enthusiastically. Crowds lined the streets despite cold winter weather. Church bells rang across the city. Newspapers devoted page after page to descriptions of the ceremony, the decorations, the dresses, and the excitement surrounding Britain's young royal couple. For Victoria personally, the marriage became one of the happiest parts of her life. She loved Albert deeply. Her letters reveal affection that feels surprisingly modern. She missed him whenever they were apart. She valued his opinions. She found comfort in his presence during difficult moments. Yet marriage also brought new challenges. Albert was highly educated and remarkably capable, but he was not king. Britain's constitution granted him no automatic political authority. Some politicians distrusted him because he was foreign. Others feared he might gain too much influence over the queen. Albert himself often felt frustrated. He wished to contribute meaningfully but found his official role uncertain. Gradually, however, his intelligence earned increasing respect. He became deeply involved in educational reform, scientific progress, technological innovation, and administrative improvements within the royal household. Together, Victoria and Albert transformed the public image of the monarchy. Earlier generations of royalty had often been associated with extravagance, scandal, or political conflict. Victoria and Albert instead presented themselves as devoted parents, hardworking public servants, and a stable family. Paintings showed them surrounded by children. Illustrations depicted domestic scenes rather than endless luxury. The image was carefully cultivated, but it also reflected genuine affection. Ordinary families across Britain saw something familiar in these portraits. Not because their own lives resembled palace life. They certainly did not. But because they recognized love between parents and children, concern for family, and the quiet routines of home. This mattered. The monarchy gradually became less distant and more relatable, helping strengthen its popularity. Yet outside palace walls, Britain continued changing at astonishing speed. Railways spread like veins across the landscape. Where journeys had once taken days, they now required hours. Villages became connected to distant cities. Fresh food reached markets more quickly. Letters traveled faster. Business expanded. Tourism slowly emerged. For many people, the railway represented progress itself. Imagine standing beside the tracks as a locomotive thundered past for the first time. The ground trembled. Steam billowed into the sky. Metal wheels shrieked against iron rails. To some observers, it looked like the future arriving at impossible speed. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Farmers worried about land being divided by railway lines. Some feared that traveling so quickly might even harm human health. Others wondered whether machines were replacing skilled workers too rapidly. History has a habit of making technological change seem inevitable. Living through it felt very different. Every invention disrupted someone's familiar world. Meanwhile, factories continued multiplying across Britain. Cotton mills hummed day and night. Iron foundries glowed with intense heat. Coal mines supplied the fuel that powered industrial expansion. The empire's wealth grew enormously. Yet beneath this prosperity lay difficult realities. Workers often labored 12 or 14 hours a day. Children climbed through dangerous machinery to clean equipment. Accidents were common. Disease spread through overcrowded neighborhoods lacking proper sanitation. Smoke darkened city skies. River water became polluted. The Industrial Revolution created astonishing opportunities. It also created suffering. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than simple tales of national triumph. Queen Victoria herself rarely experienced such hardships directly. She lived within palaces protected by servants, advisors, and careful routines. But reports reached her constantly. Government ministers discussed poverty. Religious leaders described overcrowded cities. Writers like Charles Dickens portrayed lives marked by hardship and inequality. Social reformers urged action. Parliament slowly introduced new laws limiting child labor, improving factory conditions, and expanding education. Progress came gradually. Often painfully slowly. But the conversation had begun. Across the Irish Sea, however, events unfolded that would become one of the darkest chapters of Victoria's reign. In 1845, potato crops across Ireland began failing because of a devastating plant disease now known as potato blight. For millions of Irish families, potatoes formed the foundation of daily survival. When harvests failed once, hope remained. When they failed again and again, hope gave way to desperation. Fields that should have been filled with healthy plants instead produced blackened, rotting crops. Entire communities faced hunger. Parents searched desperately for food. Families sold possessions simply to survive another week. Workhouses became overcrowded. Disease spread alongside starvation. Some people emigrated, boarding crowded ships bound for North America or Britain itself. Many never returned. Many never survived the journey. The Great Irish Famine remains one of the most painful subjects in British and Irish history. Historians continue debating the decisions made by the British government. Some argue that relief efforts were inadequate. Others emphasize the limitations, beliefs, and economic policies of the time. What is beyond dispute is the immense human suffering. More than 1 million people died. Millions more left Ireland over the following years. The island's population changed forever. Victoria contributed personally to relief funds and supported charitable efforts, earning the nickname the Famine Queen among some Irish people during the early stages of the crisis. Yet for many others, these gestures could never outweigh what they saw as failures of government policy. The memory remained painful for generations. History rarely allows simple judgments. It asks us instead to recognize both individual intentions and larger systems whose consequences reached far beyond any one person. While Ireland struggled through tragedy, Britain's global influence continued expanding. Merchant ships crossed every major ocean. Steamships gradually replaced sailing vessels on important routes. Telegraph technology promised communication at unprecedented speed. Scientists made discoveries that reshaped medicine, engineering, and astronomy. Universities expanded research. Museums collected artifacts from across the empire. Missionaries traveled to distant regions carrying religious beliefs alongside European customs. Explorers mapped territories unfamiliar to most British citizens. To many Victorians, it seemed as though the world itself was growing smaller. Yet expansion also brought conflict. Colonial rule often imposed foreign authority upon diverse peoples with their own histories, traditions, and political systems. Some communities welcomed trade. Others resisted occupation. Many experienced profound cultural disruption. The empire created opportunity for some and hardship for others. Both realities existed simultaneously. Understanding Victoria's Britain requires holding these truths together rather than choosing only one. Inside Buckingham Palace, family life continued. Victoria and Albert welcomed child after child until they eventually became parents to 9 sons and daughters. The palace echoed with laughter, lessons, games, arguments, music, and everyday routines. Despite royal privilege, parenting remained exhausting. Victoria adored Albert, though she sometimes found pregnancy physically and emotionally difficult. Albert devoted considerable attention to the children's education. He wanted them prepared not merely for ceremonial duties but for thoughtful public service. Their children would eventually marry into royal houses across Europe. Future generations would call Victoria the grandmother of Europe. At the time, however, no one could fully foresee how these family connections would later influence European politics. For now, Britain appeared increasingly confident. Industry expanded. Trade flourished. Science advanced. The royal family projected stability. The young queen had matured into an experienced monarch. It seemed as though the future belonged to Britain. But beneath that confidence, new tensions were quietly gathering. Across Europe, ordinary people demanded political reform. Ideas about liberty, nationalism, and constitutional government spread rapidly. Old empires faced unexpected pressures. Within only a few years, revolutions would erupt across the continent, testing governments from Paris to Vienna. Britain would avoid the violent upheavals seen elsewhere. Yet even there, change was unavoidable. And at the center of that changing world stood Victoria and Albert, preparing for an event that would celebrate industry, invention, and imperial confidence on a scale the world had never seen before. For a little while, it would seem that the British Empire had reached the very height of its optimism. But history, as always, was quietly preparing its next surprise. The winter fog drifted slowly across Hyde Park as London prepared for an event unlike anything the world had ever seen. Long before visitors arrived, workers moved carefully through the morning mist, carrying sheets of glass, lengths of iron, and crates filled with inventions from distant countries. Hammers rang softly through the cold air. Horses pulled wagons along muddy roads. Engineers studied drawings beneath lantern light while gardeners protected enormous trees that would soon stand inside an extraordinary building. For many Londoners, the structure seemed almost impossible. Its walls were made largely of glass. Its framework rose in elegant iron arches. Sunlight would pour through its transparent roof instead of being blocked by heavy stone ceilings. People soon began calling it the Crystal Palace. It was the centerpiece of the Great Exhibition of 1851, an ambitious celebration of industry, science, craftsmanship, and the achievements of nations from around the world. More than simply an exhibition, it represented a powerful statement about Britain's place in the 19th century. To many contemporaries, it appeared that human progress itself had found a home beneath those glittering panes of glass. No one believed in the exhibition more passionately than Prince Albert. Albert devoted enormous energy to its planning. He wanted the exhibition to encourage peace through knowledge and trade rather than conflict. Instead of displaying only military victories or royal treasures, he envisioned a gathering where nations could admire each other's inventions, engineering, art, and craftsmanship. It was an optimistic idea. Perhaps even an idealistic one. Visitors wandered through vast halls filled with steam engines, delicate clocks, scientific instruments, textiles, furniture, sculptures, agricultural machines, and products arriving from every corner of Britain's growing empire and from countries far beyond it. For many ordinary people, it was their first glimpse of technologies that hinted at the future. Imagine entering that immense glass building. Sunlight sparkled overhead. Thousands of voices blended into a gentle murmur. Polished brass reflected the light. Machines clicked steadily. Children stared in amazement at inventions they could scarcely understand. Merchants discussed trade. Engineers exchanged ideas. Artists sketched remarkable displays. For a little while, the Crystal Palace seemed to embody the confidence of an age convinced that science and industry could solve almost any problem. Victoria herself recorded her delight after visiting the exhibition. She admired not only the displays but also the atmosphere. People from different countries walked peacefully together beneath the same roof. It felt symbolic. And yet, beneath this celebration of progress, history continued moving in less predictable directions. Far beyond London's elegant parks and broad avenues, British soldiers found themselves fighting a difficult war on the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean War began in 1853, drawing Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and later Sardinia into conflict against the Russian Empire. Although diplomatic disputes and strategic concerns lay at its heart, the ordinary soldiers experienced something far simpler. Cold. Exhaustion. Confusion. Supply systems failed repeatedly. Food sometimes arrived late or not at all. Winter clothing proved inadequate. Disease spread through overcrowded camps more effectively than enemy bullets. Newspapers, benefiting from improving communication technologies, reported these hardships with unprecedented speed. Families back home read detailed accounts describing suffering that previous generations might never have learned about. One name emerged from this tragedy with lasting respect. Florence Nightingale. Arriving with a team of nurses, she transformed military hospitals through careful attention to cleanliness, organization, nutrition, and compassionate care. Walking quietly through dark hospital corridors carrying a small lamp, she became known as the Lady with the Lamp. Her work demonstrated something important. Progress was not measured only through machines and factories. Sometimes it was measured by kindness. Sometimes it depended upon people willing to improve everyday conditions through patience, observation, and determination. Victoria followed reports from the war closely. She corresponded with military leaders, visited wounded soldiers, and took genuine interest in the welfare of those serving the crown. The conflict eventually ended, but it exposed weaknesses within Britain's military administration. Reforms followed. Slowly. Imperfectly. Yet the lessons mattered. And while Europe watched events in Crimea, an even greater crisis was beginning thousands of miles away. In 1857, large parts of northern India erupted in rebellion against the rule of the East India Company. The causes had been building for years. Economic pressures. Political annexations. Religious misunderstandings. Military grievances. Cultural tensions. No single explanation tells the whole story. For British officials at the time, it was often called the Indian Mutiny because it began among soldiers serving the company. Today, many historians also refer to it as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 or the First War of Independence, depending on historical perspective. Whatever name one uses, the conflict brought immense suffering. Cities became battlefields. Families fled their homes. Acts of courage occurred alongside terrible acts of violence committed by multiple sides. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but its consequences transformed the British Empire. The East India Company, which had governed vast territories for generations, lost its authority. Control passed directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India 2 decades later, in 1876, symbolizing a new phase in imperial administration. Yet titles alone could not erase the wounds left behind. The rebellion changed relationships between rulers and subjects, reshaped colonial policies, and influenced politics for generations. History remembers victories and defeats. But ordinary people usually remember something else. They remember the uncertainty. The empty streets. The missing family members. The homes that never felt quite the same again. Back in Britain, Victoria increasingly relied upon Albert not only as her husband but also as her closest intellectual companion. They discussed government papers together. Albert reviewed official correspondence. He encouraged educational reform. He supported museums, scientific societies, and universities. He believed knowledge strengthened nations more effectively than ignorance ever could. Their partnership became unusually close. Victoria often admitted that Albert understood subjects she found difficult. Far from feeling threatened, she valued his judgment. History sometimes remembers great rulers standing alone. Reality is often quieter. Behind many public decisions are private conversations. Shared doubts. Careful advice. Moments when two people sit beside a fire reading reports long after everyone else has gone to bed. Then, without warning, everything changed. Late in 1861, Prince Albert fell seriously ill. Doctors believed he was suffering from typhoid fever, though modern historians continue debating the exact cause. Whatever the illness, his condition worsened rapidly. Victoria remained beside him. After 21 years of marriage, she watched helplessly as the man she loved slipped beyond recovery. Albert died on December 14, 1861. He was only 42 years old. For Victoria, time seemed to stop. Grief entered every corner of her life. She wore black clothing for the remainder of her days. Rooms associated with Albert were carefully maintained. His clothes were laid out. His shaving water continued to be prepared each morning. These rituals may appear unusual to modern observers. Yet grief often refuses logic. It follows its own quiet paths. The Queen withdrew increasingly from public appearances. Critics complained that she had abandoned her duties. Some questioned whether the monarchy itself remained relevant. Republican sentiment, though never overwhelming, gained new attention. The woman who had once represented youthful optimism now seemed distant, hidden behind palace walls and memories that refused to fade. But history has a habit of moving even when hearts stand still. Prime ministers continued changing. Governments rose and fell. Among them, two remarkable personalities came to dominate Victorian politics: Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone. They differed in temperament, philosophy, and style. Gladstone approached politics with seriousness and moral intensity. Disraeli possessed wit, imagination, and remarkable political instincts. Victoria appreciated both men in different ways but developed a particularly warm relationship with Disraeli, whose respectful charm and ability to lift her spirits contrasted with Gladstone's more formal manner. Disraeli understood something important. Sometimes leadership required not only solving problems but also restoring confidence. Under his government, Victoria accepted the title Empress of India in 1876. To supporters, the title reflected Britain's global influence. To critics, it symbolized imperial ambition. Both interpretations contain elements of truth. The empire continued expanding throughout the 19th century, stretching across continents and oceans until people famously remarked that the sun never set upon it. Ships carrying British goods crossed the Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, entered the Indian Ocean, and sailed into the Pacific. Telegraph cables connected distant colonies. Railways spread across continents. Maps shaded enormous territories in red. For many Britons, the empire represented prosperity, exploration, trade, and national pride. For many living under colonial rule, experiences varied enormously. Some benefited from new infrastructure, educational institutions, and commercial opportunities. Others experienced dispossession, unequal treatment, economic exploitation, or restrictions upon political freedom. History asks us to acknowledge these different realities together. Empires are rarely remembered in only one way. As the decades passed, Victoria gradually returned to more public duties. Golden Jubilees celebrated 50 years upon the throne. Then came the Diamond Jubilee in 1897. Crowds filled London streets. Soldiers marched representing colonies and dominions from across the globe. Bands played. Flags fluttered in summer sunlight. The aging Queen, once the uncertain teenager awakened before dawn at Kensington Palace, now stood as one of the most recognizable figures on earth. Children had grown into grandparents during her reign. Entire industries had appeared. Photography had become common. Telephones existed. Electric lighting slowly replaced gas lamps. Railways linked nations. Cities expanded beyond recognition. Few reigns had witnessed such astonishing transformation. And yet, even then, the future remained uncertain. Europe's great powers competed increasingly for influence. Nationalism strengthened. Military alliances multiplied. Many believed prosperity would guarantee peace. History, however, was quietly preparing another century. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901 at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She had reigned for more than 63 years. Millions had known no other monarch. Across Britain and throughout the empire, church bells rang in mourning. Newspapers printed long tributes. Crowds gathered silently as her funeral procession passed. An era had ended. The age remembered simply as the Victorian era left behind extraordinary achievements in science, engineering, medicine, literature, education, and industry. It also left difficult legacies connected to inequality, imperial expansion, colonial rule, and the rapid social changes that accompanied industrialization. Queen Victoria herself remains a figure of fascinating contradictions. She was shy, yet immensely famous. Powerful, yet constitutionally limited. Deeply emotional, yet expected to symbolize national stability. She presided over unprecedented expansion while privately mourning the loss of the person she loved most. History has a habit of turning people into symbols. But symbols do not laugh with their children. They do not write affectionate letters. They do not grieve quietly in empty rooms. Victoria did. Perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate. Not because she was perfect. Not because every decision made during her reign deserves celebration. But because she lived through an age when the world changed faster than almost anyone could fully understand. Factories replaced fields. Steam gave way to electricity. Empires reached their greatest extent even as the ideas that would eventually challenge them quietly gathered strength. Standing at the center of that transformation was one woman who never chose the burden placed upon her, yet carried it for more than 6 decades. And if you are still listening, perhaps the streets of Victorian London have grown quiet once more. The lamps are burning low, the palace windows are dark, and the great steam engines have settled into the distance. The voices of ministers, workers, inventors, soldiers, and queens now belong to history, but their stories continue to travel gently across the years. Thank you for spending part of your evening on this slow walk through the life of Queen Victoria and the empire that reached its greatest height during her reign. There will always be another forgotten road to wander through the past. But for tonight, let the silence return, let the history fade softly into the night, and allow yourself the simple comfort of rest. Even after Queen Victoria's funeral procession passed through silent streets in January 1901, her story did not truly end. In many ways, it was only then that the world began to understand the scale of the age she had helped define. The black mourning banners would eventually be taken down. The church bells would fall silent. A new king would ascend the throne. Yet the Britain that entered the 20th century was, in countless ways, a country shaped by the 63 years of Victoria's reign. It is easy to imagine history as a sequence of dates, names, and wars. But the Victorian age was something people lived every single day. It was heard in the whistle of steam locomotives before sunrise. It was seen in the glow of gas lamps reflecting on rain-soaked streets. It was felt in crowded railway stations where families embraced before long journeys. It was present in schoolrooms where children learned to read, in factories where thousands worked beneath towering chimneys, and in distant ports where ships carried goods between continents. By 1901, the British Empire stretched farther than almost any empire in history. Nearly 1/4 of the world's land and people came under British rule or influence. Maps in classrooms were often colored red to show the empire's enormous reach. To many Britons, this inspired pride. To many others living within the empire, it brought a far more complicated experience, one shaped by opportunity for some, but also inequality, political control, and the loss of local independence for many communities. History asks us to hold both truths together. The empire encouraged global trade, scientific exchange, engineering, and communication on an unprecedented scale. Railways crossed continents. Telegraph cables linked distant cities in minutes rather than months. Universities expanded. Medical knowledge improved. New inventions transformed daily life. Yet those same networks often depended upon colonial systems that benefited Britain more than the territories it governed. Wealth flowed toward London while many colonies struggled with unequal political power and economic exploitation. Neither story cancels the other. Together, they form the complicated reality of the Victorian world. And this is why Queen Victoria continues to fascinate historians today. She did not personally command armies in every campaign. She did not personally design railways or invent machines. She did not write every law passed during her reign. Instead, she became something equally remarkable. She became a symbol around which an extraordinary age unfolded. Her image appeared on coins, stamps, official documents, and portraits that traveled across oceans. Children growing up in Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, New Zealand, and countless other parts of the empire knew her face long before they understood politics. Yet behind those official portraits remained the woman herself. She continued writing thousands of letters. She filled journals with remarkably personal reflections. She remained devoted to Albert's memory for the rest of her life. Even decades after his death, she often spoke of him not as a distant historical figure, but as though his presence still guided her decisions. Grief never entirely left her. Perhaps that is one reason so many people found her strangely relatable despite the enormous distance separating palace life from ordinary experience. Most people will never wear a crown. But many understand love. Many understand loss. Many understand carrying responsibilities while quietly mourning someone no longer beside them. Victoria knew those feelings. History sometimes remembers rulers only through victories and ceremonies. Yet lives are rarely defined only by public moments. Some of the most important chapters happen quietly. A letter written late at night. A conversation beside a fireplace. A long walk through palace gardens while thinking about difficult choices. A window overlooking rain falling across London. These moments rarely appear in official records. But they shaped people nonetheless. As the 20th century approached, the world Victoria left behind was changing again. The same industries that had created prosperity also fueled competition between powerful nations. New weapons emerged. Modern factories could produce not only consumer goods but also enormous quantities of military equipment. European alliances became increasingly complicated. National pride sometimes turned into dangerous rivalry. Few people realized how close the continent stood to catastrophe. Only 13 years after Victoria's death, Europe descended into the First World War. Many of the monarchs involved were her own grandchildren or close relatives. Family connections that had once symbolized unity proved unable to prevent conflict. Millions would lose their lives. Empires that had appeared permanent suddenly collapsed. The Victorian world faded into memory. And yet its influence never disappeared. Walk through London today, and the Victorian era still surrounds you. By the beginning of the 20th century, the world had quietly crossed an invisible line. The age of Queen Victoria had ended, but its echoes continued to shape nearly every corner of modern life. It is tempting to imagine that history moves in neat chapters, each ending before the next begins. Yet history rarely works that way. One era flows gently into another, carrying old ideas forward even as new generations believe they are creating something entirely different. The Victorian Age was one of those rare moments when humanity seemed to stand with one foot in the ancient world and the other in the modern one. When Victoria was born in 1819, most journeys were made on horseback or by sailing ship. News traveled slowly. Candlelight illuminated homes after sunset. Doctors understood relatively little about infection. Photography did not yet exist. Electricity remained more of a scientific curiosity than an everyday necessity. By the time she died in 1901, electric lights illuminated many streets, telephones connected distant voices, photographs preserved memories with remarkable accuracy, railways stretched across continents, steamships crossed oceans according to reliable schedules, and the first automobiles had begun appearing on roads once designed for horses and carriages. Few generations have witnessed such dramatic change within a single lifetime. Imagine being born into one world and leaving another entirely different behind. For ordinary people, these transformations were not abstract ideas. A farmer watched railway tracks cut across fields his family had worked for centuries. A young girl became the first in her family to attend a public school. A shopkeeper received goods from another city in days instead of weeks. A family gathered around newspapers carrying reports from distant continents almost as quickly as events unfolded. Every invention changed someone's daily routine. Some changes brought comfort. Others brought uncertainty. Many brought both. The Victorian era also reshaped the way people thought about progress itself. Before the 19th century, many believed life would remain broadly similar from one generation to the next. The Victorians experienced something entirely different. Every decade introduced new inventions. New discoveries challenged accepted beliefs. Scientific research accelerated. Medical knowledge expanded. Engineers solved problems once considered impossible. This created enormous optimism. If technology could transform transportation, perhaps it could eliminate poverty. If science could conquer disease, perhaps it could solve every human problem. If industry could create unprecedented wealth, perhaps prosperity would eventually reach everyone. Some of those hopes became reality. Others did not. History reminds us that technological progress and human progress are not always identical. A nation may build magnificent railways while many citizens remain poor. Factories may increase production while workers struggle through exhausting conditions. Empires may grow stronger while distant communities lose their independence. The Victorian age contained both extraordinary achievement and profound contradiction. Perhaps that is why historians continue returning to it. There is always another question to ask. Another letter to read. Another forgotten voice waiting to be heard. Queen Victoria herself could never have imagined how the 20th century would unfold. She did not witness the First World War. She never saw airplanes carrying passengers across continents. She never heard radio broadcasts entering ordinary homes. She never watched moving pictures become cinema. She never knew that 2 world wars would eventually transform the political map of Europe forever. Yet the foundations of that future were already being laid during her lifetime. Factories capable of mass production. Global communication networks. International trade. Powerful industrial economies. Modern bureaucratic governments. Expanding education systems. These developments would shape the century that followed. And this is where the story becomes quietly reflective. People often remember Queen Victoria as the woman who ruled an empire upon which the sun never set. There is truth in that image. But perhaps her greatest historical significance lies elsewhere. She ruled during an age when the modern world itself was taking shape. She witnessed the transition from an older society rooted in agriculture and local communities toward one increasingly connected by machines, science, communication, and global exchange. She stood at the center of that transformation, not because she caused every change, but because her reign lasted long enough to witness them all. There is something deeply human about that. Most lives pass quietly through history. Very few become names remembered around the world. Yet every person experiences change. Every generation watches familiar customs disappear while new ones emerge. Every family carries memories that future generations may barely recognize. In that sense, Victoria's story belongs not only to queens and empires. It belongs to anyone who has watched the world change around them. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden beneath the grandeur of palaces and crowns. History is never only about rulers. It is about people. About hopes carried across oceans. About inventions built in small workshops. About families adapting to unfamiliar times. About courage during uncertainty. About grief that never fully fades. About resilience that quietly continues despite loss. As the night grows later, imagine one final walk through Victorian London. The streets are calm now. A gentle mist drifts above the River Thames. The great clock tower stands silently against the evening sky. The lights inside Buckingham Palace grow fewer as servants extinguish lamps one by one. Somewhere in the distance, the whistle of a steam locomotive echoes softly before fading into the darkness. The empire that once seemed endless now belongs to history. The queen whose portrait hung across continents rests peacefully among generations who came before her. Yet their stories remain alive whenever someone opens a history book, visits an old railway station, walks through a museum, or pauses before a portrait that has quietly survived more than a century. History never truly disappears. It waits patiently. And every so often, on a quiet evening like this, it invites us to slow down, to listen, and to remember. Thank you for spending this peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Queen Victoria and the extraordinary age that came to bear her name. Whether you listen from a busy city, a quiet village, or somewhere far across the world, I hope this story has offered a little wonder and a little calm before the night grows deeper. For now, let the echoes of Victorian London fade into silence. Let the last steam train disappear beyond the horizon. Let the palace windows grow dark beneath the stars. And as history gently closes its pages for tonight, allow yourself to rest, knowing that somewhere beyond tomorrow, another forgotten story is patiently waiting for us to discover together.